Consciousness Explained is a book written by Daniel Dennett in which he puts forward the multiple drafts model of consciousness. This he opposes on the one hand to old-fashioned Cartesian dualism, mind-body dualism, and on the other to eliminative materialism, which seeks to identify mental phenomena with material phenomena, thereby kind of eliminating the mental domain through a reduction. Instead, Dennett takes a similar path to Hofstadter in saying that consciousness effectively is a virtual machine running on a serial virtual machine with architecture similar to that of a Turing machine, running on the parallel processing hardware of the brain. The multiple drafts model is so called because he seeks to eliminate the idea of a fixed present in the field of representation. He begins the book by criticizing phenomenological accounts, saying that we shouldn't take the subject's narrative of their own inner experience for granted. We have to be epiphenomenalists in accepting that the accounts of the subjective phenomenologist have an origin and so have to be explained, but we shouldn't accept the theoretical underpinnings of phenomenological statements. We simply have to treat them as data to be incorporated in an as yet specified theoretical construct. So one of these theory latent statements that seems self-evident phenomenologically is that we do have a single simultaneous presentation of events. And we have a locus of perspective. There is a center. There is an observer of mental contents. This Dennett seeks to deny, and instead of a single present, we have specialist systems receiving data from different regions, processing and updating in multiple drafts an ongoing, not unified singular narrative, but this kind of multiple drafts ongoing revision process. He invokes some experimental data that I wasn't aware of and I found interesting, like the phi color experiments. And I've heard of similar experiments, but I didn't know this one by name, and I didn't realize the kind of problems it presents for the idea of phenomenological simultaneity. But the experiment goes, you have dots on a screen, colored dots, and if you present them in rapid succession, our mind fills in the gap. We intuit a motion between the 2 points, and when you change between different colors, we perceive a color gradient. And so when, right after the first flash, we think that we begin to see this gradient process and this motion. But in fact, the sense data that we're getting is the dot by itself, and then at some point later, the second dot. So it seems that we kind of go back and revise what we saw initially as a stationary dot as a dot in motion. And it gets lost in these multiple drafts and revisions of how we're perceiving the present as we go, that it was a stationary object. So we can't trust our own, perception of what we just in fact experienced in the kind of Cartesian theater with the little homunculus, the observer sitting at the center of the field of representation. We can't trust the perception that we have retrospectively that there was this one and only simultaneous sequence of events. And that is an idea that, in light of the phi color experiments and similar experiments with sound and things like that, I think we do have to kind of take seriously, that we don't just have one simultaneous presentation from all the different sense systems and from reason, but things are integrated and localized in different areas, and then we kind of arrive at a narrative of our immediate experience based on probing, based on our own questioning of that experience. And our own probing of our immediate past actually changes the narrative that we end up constructing. So it's counterintuitive, but it kind of does comport with the way that phenomenologically things seem to go. Now, I don't think that Dennett addresses the hard problem, even if we don't have a single simultaneous present of conscious experience per se. There is still what Kant would term the transcendental unity of apperception. There is the many and one presented all together somehow. And that togetherness, I don't see Dennett address satisfactorily, and I don't see Hofstadter address it satisfactorily either. So I don't subscribe to the multiple drafts model in its entirety, but I think there are good points there to take. I'm not one of these people who thinks that you ought to completely reject a philosopher if they have some negative opinions. I know Dennett has a lot of harmful opinions. Anyway, one of the things that I appreciated in the book was the idea that introspective narrative, explicit verbal narrative, so the inner monologue, may have evolved as a means of facilitating communication between different regions of the brain. And he cites, and this isn't him coming up with these connections, other people have observed this same evolutionary theory or generated it, but he cites medical conditions where people, like blind sight is one of these, where the brain is able to assimilate certain information, but the verbal authorial agent producing meaningful speech doesn't register that. Their body, certain elements of their body may respond to visual stimuli, but they don't think that they actually see. And so this implies that we can locally respond to stimulus without having a global conscious recognition of that fact. And so basically what internal monologue may allow us to do is to go around certain blocked neural pathways, or there just isn't a built-in connection between two different subsystems, specialized subsystems, and speaking what the thinking generated from, say, the left hemisphere of the brain in one particular domain, speaking that aloud presents that information to the organism environmentally. And so saying things to yourself may actually change your thinking. And similar to how we construct a narrative of the immediate past and deal with issues pertaining to a phenomenological present, there's the idea that we don't actually know what we want to say as we're generating the words to say it. There is a feedback, and we don't simply search for the right words to approximate the meaning that we already have in mind, because you'd have to resort to a similar kind of homunculus with his already pre-established mentalese meaning sitting there and then looking for the linguistic construction of it. There would be an infinite regress, basically. How did that inner man with his inner meaning in mental speak, how did that person generate the already existing linguistic phrase that now needs translation? A similar process of an inner homunculus. That's the problem with the Cartesian theater, where there's like an inner observer with things are presented to them on some kind of screen. Well, you're just kind of offsetting the question of how these things are presented globally to an organism, because the homunculus sitting there in the Cartesian theater is using eyes. It has their own little representational world and their own inner homunculus. So this infinite regress is an explanatory problem. It's a deficiency in classical Cartesian dualism. So we have the same kind of problem when it comes to the authorial subject of language. We have something in mind that we'd like to say, that's the idea, and then we search for the words to express this. But that process would have to, again, be shifted back onto the original active meaning in the mental language. And so instead, we have a model where we are looking for terms at hand to satisfy emerging semantic contents, and the things that we happen to have on hand feed back on the mental contents, the semantic contents that we'd like to express, and change it. So what we are able to express alters what we would like to express. But then after the fact, we feel as though we've expressed what we originally intended to say, but this ends up being confabulation. We are kind of narrating after the fact and making it up what we just did and what our intentions were. I think a little bit of reflection on your own experience and how you talk to people will reveal there is definite truth to this. So that's why I'm making this video, because I felt compelled to, as one quote, I can't remember the person who generated the quote, but I won't be able to know what I think until I hear what I say. And so that's why I wanted to make the video, because it's important to articulate the kind of convergent strains of meaning that are coming from specialized systems within the brain. Say on the one hand, my spatial intelligence is working out, for instance, I'm reading a book that was recommended by one of the guys from the History of Philosophy group, the Academy group. I'm reading a book on quantum mechanics, the philosophical interpretations of quantum mechanics, which, I'm familiar with in a fairly in-depth way, but this book is much more in-depth than I have understood in the past. So maybe my spatial intelligence is occupied in some sense with some of those thoughts, like how do I conceptualize of the particle or wave in an interferometer or in the double slit experiment or in these different kind of experimental contexts, or how do I conceptualize the spin of an electron and how that generates the magnetic field? Like, what are the mental images that come to mind? How do I make sense of this? How does that plug in and interact with my causal perception? And then on the other hand, I have verbal processes that are going on relating to what's another strain of meaning that's coming in right now? I guess transhumanism and the moral argument against transhumanism, and things that I kind of am constructing, arguments that I'm constructing for some unknown future point at which I'll have to talk about this. You do this, you kind of rehearse what are my opinions on various things. And all of those different subsystems, different parts of the brain are really focused on different elements of these different strains of meaning. And sometimes synergistically, when the time comes to express these thoughts, they just neatly tie together. I've experienced this making videos in the past, but this idea that you don't know what you think until you hear what you say, that compelled me to at least try at the moment to articulate some thoughts. Another strain of meaning, now this has just become a discursive ramble, but that's kind of the point that I was getting at here. And we'll see if some kind of higher level meaning comes out of this, or if there is a thematic element. And I think probably literature often has this kind of unintentional quality. You'll have lit teachers or professors analyzing and looking at all the foreshadowing and deeper meanings, but perhaps this is just an artifact of the way that the brain, which is an association machine in many ways, puts together different levels of meaning that have been generated in parallel and then kind of funneled into a sequential process through this virtual machine of the authorial intent with its logical process. And then the role of logic is important there. Anyway, one of the other strains that I've been thinking about that I'd like to address is the social epistasis amplification model. I guess I'm late on the boat for the Jolly Heretic channel, Edward Dutton's channel. When I first encountered Ed on an interview, I kind of wrote him off as just another evolutionist. And it's not like I don't appreciate that perspective. I do think it's explanatory in many ways. You can understand social phenomena that you otherwise wouldn't be able to. But I've been exposed to that kind of thinking for many years now, and I just didn't think there was that much more to get into. And a lot of his talks are that way. I'm kind of mostly familiar with the points that he's bringing up. But his colleague, Dr. Michael Woodley, has some very in-depth data to present, and this model is one of the things that he's talked about on the channel. So if you haven't checked it out, I definitely recommend it. Even though I've been into, in a loose way, evolutionary psychology for about a decade, looking at Woodley's stuff is definitely giving me new perspectives and enriching my understanding of social processes as well. But I do have a criticism, not of the model itself, but of their kind of extrapolations and projections of the future in light of it. But to explain the model, it is social epistasis amplification, meaning social epistasis is the idea that genes are expressed, or that gene expression is mediated through environmental factors, and particularly social environmental factors. Epistasis is a gene-on-gene interaction, so one gene can't express except in the presence of another gene, so it can't just express by itself. Well, similarly, in social contexts, certain genes that you have, the epigenetic switch won't be turned on and you won't phenotypically express them unless the social context is right. So there are certain effects relating to poverty or low SES backgrounds where you don't fully manifest your genetic potential in various ways. And this isn't just a factor of nutrition, but it's also the people that surround you and probably the cultural artifacts that you assimilate in light of that linguistic development, logical development. I can see how that clearly would be environmentally contingent. The expression of that element of the phenotype requires this kind of social epistatic process. And it's called an amplification model because they're saying that social epistasis, that process of mediated gene expression through social environment, amplifies deleterious mutations that build up in the population in the absence of purifying selection. So in an ancestral condition, a Darwinian condition, purifying selection would have weeded out, far-sighted people with a disposition towards diabetes, things like that. And so without purifying selection, mutants who otherwise wouldn't survive to procreate. So those mutations build up in the gene pool. And instead of just affecting themselves, they affect the whole social organism because group-selected patterns, you can look at it like, people assume different roles in society, partly mediated by social epistasis. And so there are certain kinds of cultural conditions that we expect to have in our process of ontogenesis. So our development is contingent on social epistatic conditions being met. And when mutants are present, they disrupt those social epistatic conditions, and certain roles within the society are not filled correctly or are inverted, or it leads to, in some form or other, dysgenic consequences. And they define in this paradigm eugenics as essentially what's good for the group selected features like high IQ or altruism, empathy, openness, things like that. And dysgenics are individually selected traits. So people who would try to free ride on the group, people who would try to do fast life strategy, reproduction, pump and dump, things of that nature, that would be dysgenically selected it helps the individual and their direct line of descent, but harms the environment in which they live. And, for those who subscribe to Dawkins' model that the only level of selection is the gene, not the individual, not the organism, not the group, Woodley would say that Dawkins conflates the unit of selection, which is in fact the gene, with the levels of selection that are operative. And it makes more sense to me that you would have these multiple levels of selection all coming into play based on, what's being killed off in the environment. If two groups are going to war, that is group selection in action, it looks like to me. Now, Dawkins in The Selfish Gene addresses scenarios like this using the term evolutionarily stable strategies, and he talks about free riding, and he talks about the conditions in which groups that reach a threshold of free riding and too many individually selected behaviors end up dying off, and so only the groups that don't have those free riders end up passing on their genes, and he's focusing on the genetic selection. But that's really describing group selection, and he kind of acknowledges this. So I don't know about the technical details, whether we should say selection only happens at the level of the gene. But even if you are a purist in that sense about genetic selection, you still have the evolutionarily stable strategy level of evolution going on, and that looks a lot like group selection to me. But this notion of the social epistasis amplification model is that group-selected traits break down in the presence of spiteful mutations that individuals can harbor, which don't necessarily harm their own prospects of reproduction, but which are socially deleterious. So they harm the normative processes of social epistasis, enculturation, and development of their peers. And they may be high status, and that might be part of how they express their influence on others, is they take on high status positions. People like atheists, feminists, these are the examples they would give of these spiteful mutants influencing the population. But there is also the idea that mutation load is simply rising as a consequence of post-industrial civilization. And there is the Flynn effect where IQ levels are raising, but that is specialized ability IQ levels that are raising, and the general factor, which is the most heritable, is actually going down. And so environmental factors are contributing to increasing scores on specialized tasks, which makes sense. People are more educated, they read more, there's more information that they process, and perhaps IQ tests are becoming more focused on those sorts of activities as well. But G, the general factor, is highly heritable, and that is going down. So there's the Flynn effect, and then the Woodley effect now is the decline in general intelligence. So now here's my criticism. That's all well enough. I don't know how social epistasis works specifically unless I look at it in terms of the expression of phenotypes that are explicitly cultural, like things that I would conceptualize in terms of pedagogy and training and the instilling of morals and things like that. I don't know about actual, biological hormonal changes as a result of exposure to others. I could see how that might be the case. So I don't know about that at a technical level, but I understand the model well enough as plausible and explanatory. It's basically a restatement in some ways of the idea that good times lead to weak men lead to bad times lead to strong men lead to good times, that cycle, just using more advanced terminology and better proof. So where I would depart from their attitude is in saying that this means that overall the IQ of humanity is simply going to drop down until we don't have intelligent people able to, man nuclear reactors or do all the sorts of things that maintain advanced civilization. It may be that we don't have all of us lumped into this same process. It may be that there is a subset of humanity that intentionally insulates themselves from the dysgenic processes that are going on elsewhere. I think that much is obvious. There are people who understand these eugenic and dysgenic processes. And if you look at the elites 100 years ago, they understood evolution, they understood eugenics, and suddenly they all dropped it. It seems unlikely to me. It seems more likely that they were into the occult at that point and understood the idea of reserving an esoteric doctrine for themselves and pushing out an exoteric, unrealistic caricature for the rest. And they may even have understood the power in deceiving the masses in this way. And if you push everyone else down with dysgenic processes and lift yourselves up with eugenic processes, your power is secure. And that is what power seeks to do, to secure itself, right? So I would predict that we do have a group of elites who understand these dynamics and who are actively setting up selective pressures within their own ranks to avoid the overall decline in intelligence that Dutton and Woodley seem to be concerned about. It's not that we're all going down, it's that the masses are going down, and there will be groups, probably multiple groups, who understand this and who respond in kind. Now, you can be one of those people. That's kind of my takeaway from all of this. It's not that we're all consigned to a descent into barbarism. It's possible to insulate yourself by creating your kind of social environment. And this ties in with the RK difference, the fast life history versus slow life history strategy, as they talk about it. There's a lot of good info on the channel. I've been watching a lot of it lately. So the K strategist attempts to create an ordered environment. The R strategist is a response to chaos. They don't engage in prediction. They simply try to produce offspring as soon as possible, whenever it's available. The K strategist attempts to establish cultural contexts, rule-based contexts, where their higher intelligence can win out and can push out R-type competitors. So the K strategist wants to create a social order that selects for positive intelligence. So that's what you have to do. The same thing that your ancestors did. If you are K inclined, you have to create that kind of environment. Now the question is, how is that environment created? Historically, through religions. Now this doesn't mean any particular religion necessarily, but what does a religion allow a people to do? Well, what does a religion contain? It contains cosmological theories, it contains metaphysical explanations, cosmogonic explanations, obviously a moral paradigm, but it goes all the way down to the deepest issues in philosophy. Or if it doesn't, that people just haven't reached that level of abstraction or that depth of thought yet. But as broad as philosophy ranges, and I'm using philosophy loosely here, but as broad as that ranges, a given religious tradition in the culture, a given religious tradition will have to respond to and create a theory in light of. And the popular religion is that which binds all of these basic philosophical ingredients together and produces a shared worldview. And why is that important? Not just because it creates a sense of camaraderie, but because people make predictions on the basis of their model of the world. So if you don't have a shared model, if you don't have shared predictions, how can you plan for the future? In order to plan for the future together, you have to basically think that you're in the same kind of world. Now, the Buddhist and the Christian think they are in very different kinds of cosmos. And so their anticipations of the future will be very different. Interestingly, there is a kind of convergence in that Maitreya comes at the end and initiates a new age. as does Christ, and there is a kind of culling. So I'm kind of, going against the argument that I'm making here, but I have to observe that, syncretism, or rather synergy, or whatever it is, between these different, there's a word I'm looking for, and I'm not coming up with it, but you can't cooperate unless you do have this shared model. And so you don't have to think of religion explicitly. If you want to avoid the general decline, you have to create a selective regime for yourself and your relatives and anyone else who you want to include in that bubble. Right? You don't want to falsely collectivize and just think about race, or just think about, inherited religions, because those religions probably won't make valid predictions about the world if they're not based on science, if they don't actually comport with empirical evidence and reason, if they are axiomatic and dogmatic. There's no use joining the Amish unless the Amish are right about the world. Because if they're wrong, they're going to make bad predictions. It's not just that you need a religion or you need something holding you together. You need something to hold you together that's also truthful. You need a model that's correct to make predictions that are correct, not just unified or coherent, if you want to survive, that is. Or if you want to reach the truth, which is another kind of transcendental goal that some people, a very few people, I think, actually have. But you don't have to look at it like just a religious tradition. What you need is a shared model of the world, not just stopping at some arbitrary level of fidelity. So you can't stop at a given kind of heuristic simplification in terms of materialism, like scientism is this, basically, saying that the world boils down to wave functions moving over time and integrating, or energy, or these various fundamental forces, or it's space-time causality, whatever set of fundamental things you boil reality down to, you can't just leave those unexamined. For many people, that's going to be sufficient, but you will always have people coming up to question that worldview if its axioms, if its first principles are arbitrary, or if they're not explained. Matter, in a certain sense, is an empty construct. We don't know exactly what we mean by that. Forces, that too, is kind of empty. We don't know what we mean by causality. There's no metaphysical groundwork for the physical theories of materialism. So, it is an effective worldview in unifying people and allowing them to plan together, but it does have this deficiency in that by not going all the way down to explain reason, to explain, how it is that the forces came to be in the first place, they can't explain the scope of reality using this paradigm. You're always going to have room for doubt, and the most intellectually honest people won't support what you're doing. And you don't want brain drain with the honest geniuses going their own way, and only the kind of Machiavellian geniuses and bureaucrats sticking around and supporting your system. That's what we have now. And that's partly what gives me hope. I don't think the elite that want to separate themselves from the rest of us, I don't think that they are really the genius type in a creative way. I think they are the domesticators. They're the ones who've domesticated the rest of us, harvested our labor and energies for thousands of years. And so I think they've been harvesting the energy of genius from, our people, other people. And as that runs out, as the Machiavellian bureaucratic intelligences are the ones that remain, they're going to diverge further from the truth and further to the willful impetus of individual scientists and influential people. So they may increase in IQ, but they're going to become more selfish. They are going to be subject to some of these same dysgenic processes that they're imposing on the rest of the people. This is probably a long-standing downside of imposing a dysgenic regime while reserving a eugenic regime for yourself, because the two populations probably won't remain completely separate and they will kind of bleed over. That's if you do it by force. Now, if voluntarily you have a religious framework or some kind of cultural framework where there's selection to come into the cultural domain on the basis that you adhere to these group selected R-type, eusocial attributes and truth-seeking attributes, then perhaps you don't have this same kind of blending and you aren't influenced by those dysgenic tendencies, as long as you're able to maintain your autonomy. But if you're trying to farm the dysgenic population, then probably that's where you definitely are going to be corrupted by it in some respect. That's kind of the karmic dynamic that I would anticipate there. So that's partly why I have hope that a breakaway, so the elites are trying to break away. They're trying to create a breakaway civilization, right? Advanced transhumanist civilization relying on AI and slavery and all the sorts of dreams that Faustian civilization has been characterized by. The pursuit of immortality, all of this sort of thing. That's what they want. Now, a separate kind of breakaway group might have an advantage in that they may actually continually pursue truth. And eventually that truthful mentality, that truthful worldview will have greater explanatory power and greater predictive power. So once you can predict better than your enemy, you can strategize better than your enemy. Life is like a horse race in the sense that the way to win at the track is to have better information than other people. You don't have to have perfect information. You need an intelligent betting strategy and a little bit better information than the other people there. The way to actually allocate your bets, the winning way is to say, okay, if horse A has a 38% chance of winning, horse B has a 25% chance, I'm going to bet 38% of my money on horse A and 25 on horse B. That's the optimal strategy. Now, if you have a more accurate model of the odds than the people that you're engaging in this betting with, then over the long run, you will win. You just need a little bit better information. You just need a little bit better predictive power than your opponents to ultimately win at the track to get the money. And so a group that's truth-seeking will be able to hedge their bets correctly because they'll be looking at the real distribution of possibilities. But it's also important to note that strategy of hedging your bets correctly, we have to look at the future that way, and you don't want to make hard predictions and say that transhumanism will emerge as the dominant force and we will be up against immortal boomers with like laser eyes and stuff like that. You don't want to make that hard prediction. You don't want to predict robots taking over the world or AI taking over or a collapse of civilization entirely. You want an intelligent set of options weighed according to your best models. And of course, you can't generate those models on your own. You need an entire paradigm, worldview, scientific establishment, academic establishment, institutional structures supporting all of these processes. You need that whole social, cultural apparatus to make those sorts of predictive evaluations, probabilistic assignments. But at the same time, we can apply this to ourselves and apply that principle of how to bet on horses. If you think you're getting better information by virtue of the kinds of stuff that you're absorbing online, like if you're watching this video or you're watching Dutton's channel or you're watching somebody that you think, wow, this is interesting information that I didn't know before. Well, that information can be used to make bets about the future. And if you are really getting better information than the average person in society, then that means your line of descent should be able to benefit. You should be able to make better investments than your competitors if you're getting good information. But that's only if you act on it, right? If you obsessively watch YouTube videos from these spheres or read blogs or whatever about social analysis, predictions of the future, all the kinds of stuff you waste your time on potentially, it is a waste of time unless you actually plan your life accordingly. And that's not necessarily to throw all of your eggs into one basket, but that's to invest proportionally into the scenarios and prospects that you find most likely. And putting something in, it's better to be a betting man if you think you have good information. Now, if you think you don't know at all, then Well, that's a different kind of phase to be in, right? What you need to do is to sort out your epistemology. And how do you do that? Well, you study philosophy. And I do have a website for that, pureacademy.net. Check that out. So I don't know if I really have put a bow on the different topics that I addressed. There is some level of, what's the term for it? I'm still blanking on this term. Carl Jung refers to this phenomenon, synchronicity. Synchronicity is what I'm thinking of. So I don't know if there's been a huge degree of synchronicity in this video, but some of the things that I talked about, you have to say what you think in order to know what you think. You don't have this finished narrative. The process of generating the narrative contributes to the meaning that you want to have. Although we have this sense, we have an opinion on a subject kind of inchoate in our minds, but it is kind of not defined unless you actually articulate it to someone. And a lot of us, to preserve our egos, don't want to share our opinions. This is one of the reasons in the past I have advocated, go ahead and make YouTube videos. Maybe don't talk about anything controversial. Just talk about your opinion. Maybe you remain completely anonymous. Don't put your name or face out there. Just put your voice. You can even modulate your voice. Maybe write blog posts. Whatever it is, you need to contribute to the discussion in order to see where you fall on these things. So that addresses the epistemological question in part. So there is a connection there, because you don't know what you know until you try to express it. The expression of your knowledge is part of the solidification of your knowledge, which is obvious if you actually, read a textbook. You aren't going to remember that subject material unless you do the assignments. There's a reason for the homework. You have to actually engage in the practical exercises. So that means, acting in this context of like broad social analysis, that would mean acting out predictions and investments in light of the information that you're getting, and not acting as though that's a final solution, but it is a modus operandi, an epistemological way of being that over time will allow you to correct your errors. But you need that feedback process. You can't just passively receive information your whole life. You need to produce information, produce outcomes, produce actions, and see the consequences of them in the world. Right? I'm an experimental thinker. I've tried experiments many times. I'm still trying experiments. Pure Academy is one experiment. This video is an experiment, and I encourage experimentation. And that is for the purpose of understanding what you really know and testing what you know and building up that model. But that also helps you, engaging in action and experimentation, helps you to construct this social domain that you know that you ultimately need, anybody needs, if they don't want to sink down with the masses into stupidity. Because unfortunately, that's where most of us are headed. So when you make your plans for your life, as far as predictions, the statistics are pretty solid on the IQ decline. So do you want to invest in the mass society? Probably not, because your grandkids are probably not going to look like you, and they're probably not going to be nearly as intelligent as you. So there's no helping them, right? Your line of descent is just kind of being cast out into chaos. And do you want that? That's not moral in my opinion. If you're going to have kids, you want a good environment for them, not a bad environment. So you want to create an environment. That means being active yourself, talking with others yourself. That's what Pure Academy encourages. And yes, we are starting at the far other end from where we are now. We're starting in an age-long past that seems irrelevant, but that is kind of the birthplace of this conversation, and I think it helps to go back there. And, in the meantime, you can still have contemporary discussions, but if we don't ever look back, I think we're going to forget ourselves, basically. And there's also a genetic argument in that these people were very different from us in certain regards, like the level of Neanderthal admixture was higher than it is today. And so perhaps they had different ways of thinking that we aren't so good at today. Maybe their IQs weren't way higher than they are now, but then again, maybe they were. But perhaps they have alternative ways of thinking, holistic, global thinking that's not captured on IQ tests per se. Maybe that kind of spirit is what we need, and maybe that's what I'm trying to do by just creating this hodgepodge of a video that's reminiscent of a certain other YouTuber you may know. But thank you for listening.